Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from. Larry Wilson here with Gary Higbee, and also Mike Shaw is our producer, technical coordinator in the background. And with any luck at all, we won't need Mike's help, Gary? But but first of all, Gary, thanks very much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who don't know Gary, Gary and I go back a long ways. He was the co-author of the first book, Inside Out. Gary was also the first Safe Start customer in North America. Back in his days with a former employer. There's a few of them before he finally came to work with us full time. But Gary is a CSP. He has a executive management and business administration degree, an engineering degree. He's Safety Professional of the Year award from the American Society of Safety Professionals. I was actually there in San Diego when Gary received the Distinguished Service for Safety Award from the National Safety Council, which is the highest award a person, I think, can get from the council. I'm not 100% sure of that, but all in all, one of the most highly decorated safety professionals. But for those of you who have been watching this show for a while, typically what impresses me is people's ability in the real world, not so much the theoretical world, although I acknowledge that's where things, ideas have to come from, but they seem to come better from people who've spent a fair bit of time in the trenches. And Gary spent more than a fair bit of time in the trenches. The title here is What's New, What Isn't, and What Works. And it's the last part that I was trying to lead up to here with the what works, because as I listen to all of the new ideas that are out there, as Gary listens to all of the new ideas and theories that are out there, one of the things that just comes, I don't know, I don't want to be too sensational here, Gary, but it's like exactly when you and I met in April of 1997. We are both at a special advisory board in Dallas for a company that produces safety training media. At the time, I think these were not even DVDs. I think it was mostly VHS videotapes and booklets or collateral material that would go with it. And this was a Saturday. Gary'd given up a weekend. I'd given up a weekend. I was representing Canada. He was representing the manufacturing industries in America. Basically, there was somebody there from oil and gas, somebody from chemical, somebody from railroad, somebody from I don't know what other. There was another transportation guy. Bill was there from Big Pharma. But anyhow, they had this special advisory board group, and they were talking about what should we make. And I got up and I did this little spiel on the 3 stages of behavior-based safety, saying, all the buzz out there right now is for companies to go to peer-to-peer behavior-based safety systems or processes. But if you've got a company, you guys, where the if the supervisor isn't making the guy wear the face shield at the grinding wheel, and you now want to try to get the employees to go and enforce rules that supervisors ignore or condone, I have spent enough time in the field to know that this is not going to go well. I've seen safety reps try to do this and it didn't go well. So I got up and did this. Gary then got up and went through his 5 stages to world-class safety, of which the last 3 were almost identical to what I'd presented. He actually thought I'd copied his stuff, but then he realized I was from Canada and we kind of came to the great minds think alike, or we didn't like the other part, you know. But Gary, this is so much about what, you know, if I can, I want you to take a bit of time, and if you can go through, like, because what, if you look at some of the things that are out there now, it seems to me that they are very, very much aimed or touted at the level 5 companies that are all right out, you know, at the very, very top. And, you know, one of the big movements in Europe right now is the 1% safer. And if you are at zero or very close to zero, getting everybody to think about what could we do to get even a little bit better, creating all that mind on task, that's great. But if you got a lot of, like, you know, you got a lot of serious stuff going on and people aren't wearing fall arrest harnesses and things like that, I mean, I'm not sure 1% safer for SIFs is enough, right? You know, if you're so, can you take us through, like, take us through a bit of the 5 stages if you can, Gary, and sort of fill in the blanks on the way in terms of, you know, what would be good for each stage, or however you want to frame it.
Okay, a little is what I went through. Just as a segue, safety performance in the world isn't all that good. In fact, I can talk to the U.S. numbers. TRIRs or recordables pretty flat, kind of a 1.5%, maybe a 2% change every year. Deaths in the last 10 years are up. But back in the 60s, we didn't have OSHA and we didn't have the data. Not at least not the way it is with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I was kind of flying by the seat of my pants, trying to figure out how an engineer who really didn't have a lot of safety background could put the pieces in place and work through it. So I ended up kind of just evaluating myself, organizations that I work with directly, and I came up with stages to walk through. So I'm going to explain them to you. If you want to take notes or you want to call me later, I'd be happy to send you a PowerPoint. In fact, I think there's an article on the Safe Start webpage if you'd like. So at first, the first thing we realized is we didn't know how bad we were. So the organizations go through this realization stage that says, hey, we've got to do something better. And it happens at different times in different places. But if you have a regulator on top of you and you're not doing well, if you have a serious injury or a set of serious injuries, or your union is not very happy, in fact, your employees in general, and you're not very happy with what you're at, where you're at, you know you have to do something different. So you have to go through this realization stage, and that's stage 1. Well, what do we do better? Well, then you move to stage 2, and there's a lot more people in stage 2 than there are stage 1. That's a fairly small percentage.
Yeah, it kind of goes up like a,
yeah, it's a diamond.
It's a diamond
shape. Yeah, it's a diamond. So now we go up into stage 2, and you'll recognize this one. It's basically traditional safety. Rules, policies, procedures. Let's rewrite what we got. Let's do everything we can. Let's try and make ourselves legally compliant, do the right thing. And as we migrate up through that, we'll get to a point where we're pretty well compliant. In other words, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. That's where the points of this diamond are. They're out there. And there's a little space above the legalish part or the traditional part for employee participation, because we didn't have that a lot in the 60s. You just got told how to do your job and you were expected to do it. And guess what? If you do your job good, we get paid. If you don't get your job done very well, your replacement will be here next week and they'll take care of that real quickly. So we got to that stage, and that's where a lot of companies just try to get to. Let me meet the rules, policies, procedures, do the best I can, get the training in there, and then we're going to be fine. And the answer is no, you're not going to be fine, because we still have accidents, certainly still have very severe accidents. We're not quite there. So then the third stage, was observation feedback process, and they've been
I
around for.
remember I remember you telling me, so you had all this stuff in place and you were still having issues. This was with the former employer again.
I
And
couldn't keep it
so,
out for a while.
and I,
Yeah.
I remember you doing this, like, because I've seen it. Like, you gotta understand, we've spoken at conferences all over the world, Gary and I, like for years and years ago. So it's not, but every now and again I'll hear a new story. And he goes, so then I go out to see how all of these policies and procedures that these guys have never had before, the poor souls, now I've equipped them with all of this, and they've got all the gear and they've got everything they need. So I go out to see how it's all going. And used to do this thing, and I came back and I was shocked. I was white as he goes. They weren't they weren't doing it all.
They weren't
And I
doing
can
it.
remember just I
Yeah.
remember just laughing my head off watching you do this bit because it was hilarious. Shocked. I was shocked. And of course, I started with the STOP program. So that's all I was doing was going out and teaching supervisors to, how to gently go out and enforce the rules and the procedures without whacking people over the head, which they were reluctant to do. So you get to this, is I call stage 3, as you say, is where you've now got some sort of supervisory observation process. If you wanted to be whatever, you could call it an audit process. In other words, you're making sure that the people are wearing their seatbelts on the plane. Like when the flight attendants come by, they look and make sure, right?
Yeah.
That sort of stuff is going on. Now, what happens after that, Gary?
Well, stage 3 is much more supervision. I will caution you that what we're trying to do with an observation feedback process, nothing wrong with this, is we're trying to get leading indicators. The idea is we can kind of give us some direction. And then the next stage 4 was, well, that's working pretty good. We're getting leading indicators. As long as the leading indicators are accurate, we're pretty good shape. Let's go to employee participation. Let's let the employees actually do some of the observations, and they would be taught to observations. And the idea was that if we went through each of those stages and the employees are participating and we're basically legally doing everything we're supposed to do, and we got the right PPE and we get all the way up, we would get to stage 5, which I thought was utopia, that we would actually have ducks in order, and the injuries would be down, at least some of them reduced in severity, and we would be just fine. And it didn't work.
Well, it's not that it didn't work. It's just it wasn't everything as it turned out. I mean, but Gary, when I presented the 3 stages to behavior-based safety, the 5th stage was that, you went from supervisory, and if you kept it friendly enough, then you could go to peer-to-peer. And once people started doing this on a planned basis, the idea was that it would just naturally migrate into peer-to-peer intervention in real time on the floor. And I remember you telling us a story, asbestos removal or something like that, or whatever it was. It was hot and everything else. And the one guy, like the peer-to-peer observation. And anyhow, do you remember they were working up?
Well, they were working on removing asbestos with glove bags high up in a foundry. They were in a foundry, and the pipe that they were taking the asbestos off of was about 3 feet in diameter. So they're chunking it off and putting it in. They're in a room, and it's hot and it's miserable. And I remember that there were 2 groups that were working. One was on an elevated platform. They had their suits on and their respirators and their harnesses, and they were tied off and everything was right. And on the other one of the guys wasn't quite tied off, didn't have his lanyard, didn't have his harness with him, but he's up working. And the guys in the other group, the other lift came down. They said, hey, we got to tell him. And they went over to him and said, hey, come on down. You don't have your your harness? You don't have your lanyard. Yeah, I was in a hurry to get in here. I forgot it. I left it outside. And if any of you know, the going in and out of a secure area with asbestos takes forever,
Yeah,
decontamination and all that. And so he had decided on his own the best thing to do was to continue working. So he knew all the rules, he knew all the procedures. Nobody was yelling at him to get in there and go to work. He forgot his personal protective equipment. So there were lots of gaps in the system. And the other gap that we got, and Larry, we may not have talked about this very much, but when we went to employee observations, if the training wasn't adequate enough, in other words, if they didn't know the right questions to ask, and it's not just a check sheet, they weren't getting the correct answers, or they weren't doing the observations at all, and they go back and fill them out. Because we found out that the leading indicators were incorrect, many of them. Now there's a double whammy with that. One is the company will pay money, trying to do training, do whatever they need to do to alleviate a problem that's there. It's saying it in the data, but that's not really a problem. But
no,
there's over here they're not doing that they should be doing. So we ended up paying time and money trying to correct things that weren't necessarily a problem, and we were missing these big gaps.
right. But I remember with those guys in the asbestos, it was that the guy that was up there without the lanyard, he phoned you that night and said, "Hey, this stuff works, right?"
Yeah,
And he
yeah,
could have,
that's
I mean,
what.
technically he could have been fired because, you know,
Yep.
that was one of the big three you had. But you know, he was saying that this stuff works. So I think that was certainly at the time, and I'm not sure it's changed much, Gary, that culture where you had peer-to-peer intervention in real time was considered utopia, right?
Right. We thought
But
we were the best.
except that there were still serious injuries and fatalities. You know, one of them you went through, you know, was very close to home, if you will, personal, that obviously kept, you know, you looking and going, okay, there's got to be more than just being able to get peer-to-peer intervention in real time. And obviously, if people are driving by themselves, how much of, you know, how much is that going to help at the point of contact, right? So there was obviously more, or there was further, and you talked about it in further conferences as you push sort of to pass 6 as being advanced personal safety skills. You know, that the habit piece and building things to habit strength, that was, I don't know, 1988 to 1992 sort of thing. You know, I introduced self-triggering to you in 97 and to the workforce at the former employer there. And the other thing was the look at others technique. Ironically, it was a competitor that I remember saying at the bigger sites, you know, where they had, you know, hundreds of observers, that the observers tended to be 5 times safer than the non-observers. And since I was going around doing all of these observations and teaching supervisors how to do all of these observations, whether I liked it or not, I mean, I'd become like incredibly attuned to spotting hazards and people and their behaviors and all the rest of that sort of stuff. And I realized how much it did for my own awareness. So, you know, I think looking at that, not to tout our book again, but as you said, Gary, looking at it from an inside out point of view, as opposed to just the intervening in real time point of view, and putting all that together, that was new, certainly. But what about all of the other stuff? Like I remember even back then you telling me about your approach to serious injuries and fatalities. And like I sort of mentioned before, we got talking about it when we were talking about just culture and and discipline. And you were saying that, well, there was only three things, working at heights, lockout, tagout, and confined space entry. And I know because I trained you and I made sure that you knew. And those things can kill you. Now, you never said those are the only things that can kill you, but certainly from a discipline point of view and all the rest of it, I think every one of us can see that that is perfectly or totally congruent. And then I remember you and me walking away from this session on, I don't know where it was, ASSP, NSC, whatever, but it was on SIFs. And you and I both, you just go, I was doing this 35 years ago, and I can't believe they're saying this is new. So this is where I guess we get to the sort of crux of the matter, Gary. Can you talk a bit about all of that, and then if you can just sort of migrate right into the culture piece, because as I go around the world, Gary, I hear and see people selling culture change all the time, and they don't understand that you can't. And anyhow, you can change the climate. And, I remember that like stuck with me the first time you said it, just kind of like your 5 stages, right? So could you take us through, if you will, what's really new or what isn't in terms of the SIF thing and the culture?
Okay. With our data, we ought to be trying all kinds of different things, and we are. And because of the frustration in the market, because a lot of what we're doing doesn't seem to solve the problem or doesn't seem to do well enough to back it off, we'll buy anything. I see stuff sold that is amazing to me. It's drive me crazy. But the first thing I had to get a hold of was I had to get the working climate headed in the right direction. You can't change culture without changing the climate. And so the 5 stages were what I was doing to try and get the climate. And then people found out that, hey, I think at that time as a plant manager, hey, he's going to discipline. If you do 3 things, one of 3 things, you're going to have to be in the front office with your boss, with your boss's boss, explaining to him why you should even be allowed to work there anymore. And I only ever fired one, but he was belligerent through the whole process. But these major things, so I had to get the climate. I had to work with the supervisors. I expect you to make sure people wearing their personal protective equipment. If they don't need it, then you tell me why we don't need it, and then we'll take it off the list. But we'll
quit buying it if we don't need it.
Yeah, that's right. I want reasonable, accurate, personal protective equipment rules, policies, and procedures. I don't want to do anything that's silly. I want to do what's beneficial to our employees. Because believe me, I wouldn't still be working if I didn't think safety was worth working. And it's the hardest thing I ever did as a manager. If you have a production problem, you know exactly where the problem is. You can solve it pretty quickly. It's perfectly visible. If you have a quality problem, may not as visible, but you can solve it. But if you have a safety problem, it's too late to solve it after you've got the problem. You got to try and look at risk assessments and those types of things to try and get an idea of what the risk really is. So anyway, we're moving forward. We need stuff, and we need human factors for sure. But some of the stuff we have now, I don't see anything wrong with operational performance, but the Japanese were doing it in the 1970s. Kaizen projects.
I was going to ask you about that specifically in terms of, not to, and this is certainly like, I've got nothing against, first of all, the idea of decision making at the shop floor or at the pointy end of the stick, especially well trained, well informed decision making, is pretty hard to argue with. But when I think back to some of the sawmills that I started working at the beginning, and the people saying to me, "Hey, you don't have to wear safety glasses in this mill. It's not a rule." And I'm like, I wouldn't work here if I couldn't wear safety glasses. You got, I mean, stuff flying all over the place. I mean, anyhow, there's that, yeah, it's okay. You don't need to wear a harness here. We've got an exemption. You've got an exemption from gravity. Interesting. Anyhow, so when I think back to, HOP at those places, it would not be a good idea at all. But it certainly would if, you had a kind of a machine that was humming like a Swiss watch. That would be, so in other words, you're at level 4, you're at level 5. That would be maybe a great thing to be looking at. But depending on, you're back in the reactive stage. No, we're just realizing we got a problem that we're going to have to deal with, and we're not sure exactly how we're going to fix it. We know what the laws are, but they've only got so much faith in that too, right? So anyhow, tell me though, Gary, a bit about like this, the culture thing. I mean, I started off, I'd make people, the managers, read an article on creating the safety culture. It was published in 1991. It was a 3,000 word article. It was a bit of a risk asking people to start the session off by reading an article. It wasn't like starting off with a bang. It was like getting an extra cup of coffee and getting to read this article. But it did, I mean, it did sort of get at what you were trying to say, which is you can't, it's A plus B equals C, the culture, right? In other words, and you can affect the A's and the B's and the things that go into it, but the culture is the product of all of those things that you're doing out there. So you can't just go like, the idea is you do a perception survey. The survey identifies gaps. Typically, the company that gave you the survey happens to have training that fills those gaps. And then they do another perception survey and they find another gap. And usually they got training to fill that gap too. And that's usually about it, because by now they've kind of, milked as much money out of the system as they can. And they're on to find a new client. What do you, that whole approach is that like, like versus more of what you're saying, trying to change the climate? I mean, does it work? Have you seen it work?
Well, I'm not going to speak badly about anybody trying to do
No. There's a lot of folks out there doing it this way, the perception survey way. I mean, if in the end you ended up improving the climate, then I think the net result at the end of it all is that it would work. Yes.
Yeah. I ended up with the focus that I could change the climate. I couldn't necessarily change the culture. Culture had to evolve. And so if I do a good job with the climate and do the right thing, get the employees involved, they're part of the decision-making process, and we work through it together, they're more likely to use whatever that solution was. And so I think that's fine to do that, but too much of safety is a business. What's new in safety? We went to the ergonomic thing, and all you could see at the major conferences was ergonomics. And we went through the behavioral-based thing, and we've gone through the traditional thing. All of those things are part of what we need to do, and they all have to be handled pretty well so we can change the culture so that the right thing happens at the right time, for not because they were told, it's just the right thing. But you got to get the climate first, and then you can start work, because the culture will never change. The climate sucks. You're not going to get people involved to go, every time I go to get a ladder, the foot's broke, or the fork truck drivers all drive too fast. You got to take care of those things first, and then you can go to the other end of it.
Is the climate more Like, could you say it's more cosmetic? In other words, you want to make sure that what people see is clean and orderly and isn't, it isn't dingy and dirty per se, like, is it almost like, a bit of that as well too, Gary? I don't want to go too far down this
There's
particular
so
road,
much
but
we could do it. Well, I'll tell you about a company I'm working with now. The place was a disaster. It looked filthy. They'd shut the place down and clean it up before the customers came in to look. The safety performance was poor at best. And we started simple. I want you to paint a yellow mark in front of every electrical on the floor, in front of every electrical shut off. I want you to put a red one on the floor underneath every fire extinguisher, and I want you to put a blue one under the floor on the floor for every eye wash. That's all we did the first step. And all of a sudden, they're not throwing stuff in front of the fire extinguishers. And I continue to hit them with training. And I would mention thank you for all the work you're doing, trying to keep the place neat so we can get to the eye washes when we need them, and we can get to the electrical shutoff when we need to get there, and we can get to the fire extinguisher if we happen to need it. And that's what we started. That whole climate of this throwing junk in front of the fire extinguisher and all that stuff had to go. And then we
it didn't start with HOP, in other words.
No, I didn't start with HOP. Then we went to work platforms, and I want to get the stuff off the work. And why do our man lifts have all the crap and spare parts left on them when they did the last job? Why isn't maintenance putting that away? Why do I have conduit leaning up in the corner of every workplace in the shop? Well, we'll use it someday. Well, no, take it back and put it in the storage area. So you just start climate, you hammer away at it, and then you make sure you're doing your training and doing what you need to do, and the training's accurate. And then we take the training and we start making it more acceptable to the workers, because the workers started a migration. Today, tech training works pretty good with the younger workers. Old people like me can't even get the computer turned on, let alone take a look at it. So
or share the screen. But anyhow, we won't.
Which we did this morning. So what we're doing is we're evolving over this period of time, and a lot of stuff we're doing, we've been doing just in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, as far as that climate thing, I remember though this one sawmill. The company was doing very well in terms of injury performance. They were, trending towards #1 in Canada in forest products, but they had a few mills that were, like everybody, that weren't as good as the other ones. And I'm talking to the management group after I've been through sort of the walkarounds, and I said, you know what? I think there's about 5 tons of scrap chain just left around this place. I don't know how many years it's been here, but you guys should probably decide whether you're going to use it or whether you're not, and get rid of it, and start making the place look better. And this one supervisor stood up and he said, "That's the trouble with you consultants. You come in here, you spend a few hours walking around, you think you know everything. There is not more than 3.5 tons of scrap chain lying around here." And he sucked me right in. It was laughing his head off. But they got the point, right? In other words, it's been here for 20 years. We're probably not going to use it. Maybe we should get rid of it, start working on the climate. But the idea, when I was talking to Gary a bit about before the show started, was that in terms of all of these new approaches, it's like, it depends on where you are, right? There's this old joke about, they asked the Irishman how to get to Dublin, and he says, "Oh, lad, you'd be better off not to start from here." Well, yeah, but you are where you are, right? So, I think as safety professionals are looking at all of these new approaches that are out there, I think they also need to look at, well, where are we now? And where should we be going? And if we're way down here at the bottom and we got a lot of serious injuries, amputation here and there, potential fatalities, whether they got near misreported or not, a 1% safer solution might not be the best way to go, because, it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be fast enough, right? So, in terms of, like, I remember when Keith Hull was on the show and we were talking about, what's new or what's different. And he said, look, that all of them won't work if you don't convince the people that you care, like that's genuine and it's concerned. And I thought that was an interesting common denominator out of all of the approaches. But in this particular case, what I was trying to get across to folks is you've also, it's not just what might sound good to you or what you think might work with your folks, or quite frankly, what might be a more pleasing theory. It's really dependent a bit on where you are now in terms of your own culture. So could you give people maybe just a quick, I don't know whether you want to call it a summary, Gary, or a quick rundown again of the 5 stages, and sort of, here's how you'd kind of know whether you were in stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, stage 5?
Well, stage 1, we don't have very many companies like that. They're not. They're in trouble. They've got huge OSHA citations. The employees are not happy. Nobody seems to be happy. Likely, they are not profitable or marginally profitable. Often owned by another company, and they're just like they throw all the garbage at that place and they take care of it. So you need to buckle down and just take care of the basics right there. And then the next step is,
how would you, like, if you were walking out, like, well, I guess it's a realization, like you said. I mean, in other words, like, if you're still blind, you don't see anything, but right, something happens, there's an event or whatever it is, a eureka effect, and we've got to change, we've got to move, right? So, and there's only, there's not as many companies in that area down there. And typically we only get to work with so many of those folks too, right? They're not likely gonna, yeah.
So then you go into stage 2, and there's a lot of companies in this, and that's just getting your ducks in order and do traditional safety. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we need it. I mean, it's what's required. But what happens is the performance isn't quite where you want it to be. But it's better than what they had before, and we're headed in the right direction. So when you start looking for something to get a little bit better, then that behavioral-based safety approach starts to work. In other words, we pretty well got our ducks in order. You're not using bad equipment, and you're doing what you need to do. And that's the bulk of the companies. They're right there. So now we can start working on some other things. And I do think an observation feedback process is just fine. I think we have to watch out to make sure that the leading indicators are accurate. So the training of the observers is critical in both stage 3 and stage 4, but they need to be there. Now, the thing that we seem to miss is that, like, when we do a risk assessment or an accident, let's start with an accident investigation, we don't have any trouble coming up with how somebody got hurt or how the product was damaged or how whatever. But we don't come up with the why very well. And the why is the human factor. And in risk assessments, we can calculate risk assessments, but if we don't include human factors, then the level of risk that we think we have based on the amount of hazardous energy and the process that we're using to actually do the job, if we don't understand that when people are tired and working 16 hours days, that doesn't affect it, it does.
Well, everybody does, but it doesn't get fat when they're looking at that x-axis probability of occurrence, Gary. It's not. It's really lame though. Like, do we have, like, it's like you say, do we have safe equipment? Have the people been trained on how to use it? Do they have, if you will, like you said, the tick box and the the check mark in the box, right? You know,
Larry's gone. I don't see him, and I don't know whether I'm on. So,
hey, Gary,
help us out, Mike. What happened to Larry?
I'm not sure what happened.
It's an advantage, actually. Okay, well, let me talk about that in a little bit, and while you panic and try and get Larry back on there. So when we do risk assessments, I want people to include human factors. Okay, what are human factors? It's your work schedule. It could be, I had a period of time in my life where one of my children were using drugs. It was in my mind all the time. It affected my performance at the organization. So whether you're rushed or tired or angry or frustrated, the only person who knows that is the employee. You might be able to see symptoms of being fatigued or rushed, or even a symptom of being overconfident or complacent, but the employee knows that. And given that human factors change the likelihood of something going wrong, and therefore the hazardous energies come in contact with, if we only look at, hey, this is a hazardous energy, it's bad, but yeah, it's not very likely we're going to get in there because we have guarding on it, and we're going to be just fine. Then what happens is we don't really know what the risk is until we get to the human factor. And the human factor doesn't change the amount of hazardous energy, it changes the likelihood of coming in contact with the hazardous energy. And a stage 4 or a stage 5 company can do that. Do they? Not very often. Not very often. So all these different safety programs that are out there, we've probably done something like that once or twice before. And I didn't know much about the 1% one, so I got online and I bought the book, which is part of it. And I know that you can hire a person to come in and talk about 1%. And I'll admit that a 1% change in safety performance, if you go across the whole world, is a big number. It's a big process. But if you ask me when I was a plant manager, hey, we've got this neat deal, we can bring this in here. It's going to cost us $200,000, but we can improve our quality by 2%. I'm not buying it. Or if they brought in something and said, hey, we can actually make more widgets. We can make more widgets, our widget production by 3%. I'm not buying it. I don't even know whether the market will support it. So when we talk about 1%, I'm looking at that and going, wow, I understand where you're coming from. I think it's great. You're doing it for nonprofit. Although I think you're probably getting paid for the book. You're probably getting paid for the presentation. But it's not going to make me budge. I mean, as a plant manager, I'm going to do that. You tell me 15%, I'm on.
Yeah, exactly. But it also, like I said, again, back to the, what I've been trying to get across here, the at the very top end, you might very well get more than 1% by asking people to look for 1%. In other words, we're really good now. We don't want you to think that you have to come up with some great improvement, but if everybody looked for a little improvement, wouldn't that? And so, in other words, like that you get people engaged is going to likely win the war for you, if you will. It's not the right terminology, but so it doesn't matter that you're only purporting a small outcome. But I agree with you. It wouldn't be the kind of thing I'd want to sell to a construction manager. You can finish this 1% sooner. Really? So that part, I think, again, really dependent upon who you are right now, where you are right now. Sorry, your company's at. While my computer cut out there, Gary, did you also this wasn't on purpose. Did you also get to talk about human error a bit?
Well, a little bit, but we actually were cheering the fact that your computer went out, and we thought that was a pretty good idea. I haven't gotten into human error much. I talked about human factors.
Right. Okay.
And so if you simplify it to human error, we know people make mistakes. and we know that. And so human error is a big issue, and human error does change the likelihood of coming in contact with hazardous energy. So it's kind of that's about as far as we got.
Okay.
What else to bring up? So,
Well, and I mean, and so quite often, if you go back to the usual suspects, the electrocution, high voltage, high temperature, you can protect the people with insulating gear. And the same thing in terms of high toxicity, you can protect them with, respirators and impermeable membranes and stuff like that. So, like that part's easy enough. Heights, the fall arrest harness, you can minimize it, but you can't prevent it in the first place, like the seatbelt, minimize it, but you don't prevent the wreck in the first place. So that what I think is interesting is that there's always been engineering controls at the front end to eliminate the potential for human error. And there's been, if you will, backup or, redundancy things, fail safe, where if somebody did make an error, it wouldn't be so bad, or it would fail to a safe mode on a personal level. But if you look in the middle, like getting the human factors to stop the errors, I mean, there hasn't been a solution for that. But I think if you've been in the field for a long time, you've seen so many attempts, right? Take 2, take 5. You ever seen a poster that said think safety, or safety is a state of mind? I mean, it's not, there were all kinds of things, gory, scary movies to try to scare, all kinds of stuff to try to fill that gap in the middle. But as you pointed out, the risk assessment is likely only going to take in the front end engineering controls, the back end redundancy controls, and also basic training. In other words, do they know how to use a fork truck, a crane, etc., and do they have certification for it, right? But not nothing about the human error component, which it'll happen pretty much every time you don't plug your computer in. I think, so there we go. I know you got a great story too about running out of gas once with your wife. I won't make you tell it on camera, Gary, but it is being featured in my in the new video production, just so you know.
perfect.
Yeah. So Gary, just before we start taking some things from the audience, the last thing that I wanted to get you to, I don't know, I want to say it's more than comment on, though, because I think people need to kind of hear this from you, almost in a mentoring point of view. But we have seen people that have been commercially successful in the market that have been like, I remember them saying, hey, just give us your employees and your money. But we don't need you, the supervisors and the managers, or even the safety department, really, to be overly involved in this. And since they didn't have to spend the time, just the money, they thought, oh boy, this is great. And that very same company came back years later with leading with safety and made a fairly good business of now selling the whole leadership component. So like what I want, like, it's almost like a warning, I guess, where what I'm looking for is that if you see an offering that seems to leave out an important group, like your union or your safety department or your supervisors or your leadership, what do you think about those kinds of initiatives and their success rate? I realize I am an unmoderating moderator. I'm not very moderate here, but nevertheless.
Well, the group here we're talking to today are stage 4 or 5 people. The others aren't here, but they all get a little bit of an idea. We're all in a team together. And if you don't have every facet of your organization pulling in the same direction, it's going to be a problem. And communication has to be excellent. The safety team, the union have to be in sync. I managed plants and was a safety director. Plants were unionized. I never had any problem. As long as we were honest with each other, we kept moving forward. And if I had something I thought was much more political than it was factual that it would help, sometimes I give it to them, sometimes I didn't. But the whole idea is we got to work together, and I think that's where we're at.
I get
me that we have 5,000 people a year killed in the United States at work. That drives me nuts. And Larry, they don't know. I lost one of my friends at a plant I was responsible for. This has got to stop. The only reason I'm still working at 73 is I can't get that out of my head. We have got to move forward.
Well, what else are we going to do anyhow, Gary, besides that, right? You're not done till you're done. And people ask me that all the time. No, but there was something I was really going to hopefully get you to include here a bit in the leaving things out, like people have said to me before, well, when you made Safe Start, you made it so that it wasn't dependent on the leadership or the safety department or the supervisors or anybody. It's just that, based on people, nobody's ever trying to get hurt. And I said, well, that's because I was in the field for 15 years. And I know that you can't always, all of these groups, you can't always count on leadership, and you can't always count on the supervision, and you can't always count on the safety department, and you can't always count on the employees being willing to change. And so, what can you count on? You can count on that nobody's trying to get hurt, and people will go a little more out of their way for their children's safety than they will for their own, right? You can count on those things. So that's why. But it wasn't like we were ever trying to leave anybody out, or that I ever said things go better without good management or without good supervision. But I would really caution personally people, whatever initiative you're looking at, and there's going to be a never-ending supply. This will be the last thing Gary and I talk about before the questions, but of people with new ideas. Just make sure that there isn't that the sales component of it isn't enticing, because it leaves some people out, because as Gary says, you need everybody pulling in the same direction, or as high a percentage of everybody as you possibly can. And the last thing I wanted to sort of conclude here with was in defense, well, I don't know, of all of us, and that is the supply side of this whole equation. So, Gary, you've been speaking at safety conferences now for 26 years, I think.
By more, yeah.
Okay, maybe 27. So how many times when you go to a safety conference, and it is like you got a great title, it's standing room only, you light the place up, you get like incredible reviews, and you're talking to the conference planners the next year, and naturally you say something like, hey, do you want me to do reflecting on safety again? Or do you want me to do the third dimension of risk assessment again? What do they say?
No, we did that last year, and we won a new shiny quarter. And that's really frustrating. It just goes away. And, I think most of these conferences, some of them I speak at, have a few thousand people, well, pre-COVID. And there's always people there that haven't heard that presentation that might find it of value. But for some reason, they always want a new shiny quarter. And people don't get to hear it, is what happens.
Well, the same and the same thing obviously has happened to me. And with Tim Page, in some cases, you may be able to get them to accept a part 2, or the the next generation or something, something so that you're tying a bit of the, complacency, the silent killer part too. But I mean, that all I'm trying to say, everybody, is that the thought leaders are pressured to come up with a new topic, a new title, or a new idea. Or else the people at the conferences are going to likely move towards somebody who has, because they're worried that the people they're promoting it to are going to go, "Oh, well, I saw that last year, right?" And so they're going to go to a different conference or whatever. And this just, I mean, there's a supply side to, I mean, what are you willing to do? How many new ideas do you have? How many angles to your existing ideas can you sort of want or highlight? And so there's a bit of, there will be, it's a bit like the news. In other words, you get a bit of what you say you want as an audience by what you watch, right? Too. So that something is valid for such a high percentage of the companies below stage 5.
Mm-hmm.
They don't, they go, if they go to the conferences, they're going to hear stuff. And I mean, you've heard it before. I mean, how many times have we heard people come up to us and say, "Oh man, I love your stuff. I love it." There's not a hope in heck I'm ever going to get to do it where I'm working now, but maybe somewhere else, who knows? Anyhow, thanks. Like hundreds of times we've heard that kind of stuff, right? So, maybe if you can just sort of comment a bit on that, Gary, and then we'll.
Well, yeah, we gotta be quick because we've got questions coming up here. But we sometimes will change the title to get in. I have one that I call Rethinking Risk Assessment, which puts human factors in it. I've done it at a lot of conferences. Now I couldn't go to a conference and do that, and I'm not getting paid to go to these conferences. Nobody wants to hear it, so I'm using it in my private practice, and it works out fine. But the problem is, if it's worth it, we ought to be worth listening to it a little bit more often. And so conferences need to understand that not everybody in the conference is at their level. If they're heading up a conference and picking speakers, they're way up in the fifth division, or at least the fourth. And a lot of these companies that are coming in, they're not there. They're in 2 and 3, and so they need different types of training.
Well, I mean, and I remember even you and me going to a power, they had power plants and service and everything. It was for a city, right? And just at the end of the audit, they said, okay, I'm looking at the people and the behavior mostly. Gary's looking at the systems and the engineering, and he comes back to them and he says, "Well, I mean, you guys, you gotta at least get your supervisors participating in the accident investigations."
Yeah.
And the safety guy says, "Why?" And Gary says, "Because it's the law."
Yeah.
Like, you should know that, sunshine. Like, and you shouldn't be paying me. I'm not saying that, we're cheap per se, but I mean, we're worth what they pay us, but not for that. Okay. You can go read the law without Gary having to tell you. But anyhow, that's all, they were a little behind in the compliance and the things like that. And even I would say, look, then that's where you need to start. Put a guard back on that sprocket, clean the place up, fix the burnt out light bulbs. I mean, I've gone to places where they were having a lost time accident frequency of 48%. And they asked me, when I'm in there to implement Safe Start, and I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, we've tried everything and nothing's worked." And I'm like, well, I mean, what about just, some 101, maybe 202 here? Like, let's just clean the place up and brighten it up. Let's make sure people have got adequate training for the machines they're working. and let's see if we can get the supervisors out enforcing the rules. And then maybe, I can come back and talk to the folks about rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency. But, right now, I think your grandmother could come in here and get a 50% decrease in injuries, like climate, way back to your point. I'm looking at the comments and some questions. Thanks very much, everybody, for some of the nice comments. Lloyd, yeah, it's been a while since Indonesia for sure. And you're right. All these things are easier said than done. Okay. I figured we're close to out of time. Mike, just to make sure that I'm not sure if I'm scrolling the chat line properly. Any last questions that Gary can answer before we close out and I introduce the next session?
There is a question for Gary from Keith Hole. Did Gary find that safety was much more financially driven when he started out compared to now?
Oh, Keith, yeah. Work comp costs were the big driving factor. And today, I would say that that's not one of the big driving financial factors. Off the job will cost you a lot more than on the job. So, yeah, originally it was all about financial drive, but it should have been ethical, moral issues also, trying to get us headed in that direction. But yeah, work comp used to be the work comp got under control, and it didn't drive us very much. And we skipped the beat there for maybe 8, 9, 10 years, where we didn't really put everything into what we needed to.
I think the rest just look like great comments and discussion in the chat. So
yeah, thanks, Brian. All right. Okay. Well, look, Gary, for those of you who don't know, Gary and I, we could go on for hours and days talking. And I can't really, but we're not going to, so don't worry. But Gary, for everything, can't thank you enough, certainly. But thanks very much for doing this show. And the perspective again is, assess where you are. And obviously, if what you're hearing, fits where you are and where your culture is right now, then, it's probably worthwhile giving it a try. Right. But definitely take a good look at where you are now. I would like to caution everybody on avoiding things that leave anybody out or, imply that you're not part of we don't need you in this effort is not the way you'd want to go. You're just an office worker or whatever. I really think that's a mistake. And I also think you've also got to recognize that, like the news, we are all required to come up with something new or we will wither on the vine. So that isn't I'm not trying to cut us slack, because nobody has a right to get up there and pontificate about stuff that has no substance. I don't or give people bad messaging about safety, like, off the job safety isn't important or whatever. Like, really, like the people dying isn't important. You can never convince me of that. And I don't think you'll convince Gary of that. But nevertheless, I mean, there's a lot of good initiatives out there, and I'm not trying to dissuade you from them. Just where Gary, where can people get your 5 stages articles and things like that?
Well, they can ask me personally, and I can send it to them. But they're on Safe Start's website, and if you go to the website, and I'm trying to think, it's articles, and you just search Higbee, you'll find about 20 articles there, and that'll be one of the articles.
You're on LinkedIn as well, hey Gary, right? So everybody could find you on LinkedIn, right?
And you can find me under Higbee and Associates, which is my company. Now, I'm not the Higbee and Associates from California, the legal firm, and I'm not the Higbee and Associates that's a plumbing organization. But if you look long enough, you'll find me in there, and you could. There's some pretty good stuff on my website too. Take a look at it. Love to talk to you.
Okay. All right, Gary. Well, again, thank you very much for coming on the show. Everybody listening, thanks again so much for tuning in. Much appreciated. If you like if you like the shows, just please, please reshare the posts or things like that on LinkedIn. Again, it's certainly we're getting about 2,000 folks watching the show, so it makes it easier for me to get some really good folks to come on and talk. The next show will be a bit of a surprise in 2 weeks for everybody. And it's based on a session that Danny Smith and I did for Nucor Steel pre-COVID a couple of years ago. And it is the secrets of summer safety. And you could almost call it the irony of summer vacation. But just to give you a little bit of a highlight or a tidbit of where we're going, you're going to go hiking in the mountains. And there's one of these little sort of shed things with a warning sign about the bears, the grizzly bears. And you've got a choice between whether you can take an EpiPen or whether you can take bear spray. What do you take? What should you take? But anyhow, it's really like, all the commercials about boating safety and drinking while they're boating, and you can go to jail and lose your driver's license and everything like that. What percentage of all the fatalities do you even think involve a boat? You could even see a boat somewhere. So there is a lot that I learned when I was doing this show with Danny. It's going to be very interesting. And I think you'll also be able to see a lot of parallels as well, too, in terms of some messaging that you can give your workers, both for summer safety and also to bring back to the plant. So that will be on July the 8th, same time with Danny Smith. And I hope you can join us. And Gary, again, thank you very much for joining us this time. Mike, thanks for covering for me when my computer went out. And bye-bye, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thank you.